Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. We are back with more coverage of the 97th Academy Awards, today with composer Kris Bowers, who just received an Oscar nomination for his original score for The Wild Robot. Kris previously won an Oscar just last year for his documentary short film, The Last Repair Shop. Here to speak about the music of the film is our returning guest host, Jon Burlingame. Here's Jon.
I hope you've seen The Wild Robot, one of the year's most winning films, with a thrilling score that provides the story with a lot of its emotional power. Our guest today received one of the film's 3 Academy Award nominations. You know his work from Bridgerton, Green Book, and The Color Purple. Welcome, Kris Bowers.
Thank you, Jon. Thanks for having me. Always good to see you.
You too, man. So, Kris, since this is an animated film, were you brought on early?
I was on the film for almost 2 years. I was brought in the summer, early fall of 2022, and we finished in summer of 2024.
Had you done animation before?
No, not full animated. I'd done Space Jam, which is like partially animated, but this is my first fully animated film.
So when you came on board, what did you have to work with? Was there some finished animation? Was it mostly animatics or drawings? Or give us an idea of what you first saw.
The film was only in the animatic stage. It was, black and white pencil sketch storyboards strung together. And then I had concept art. So Kris had already done fairly extensive concept art that went into the details of how they wanted the world to look and that hand-painted style they had already started to experiment with. But that's pretty much what I had at the beginning.
So you mentioned Kris. That's Chris Sanders, the director. And I'm curious to know if he had some ideas for you about maybe directions you might go or what he was looking for musically.
From the very beginning, in my very first meeting with him, Kris talked about the role that music was going to need to play in this film because he envisioned carving out houses for music. And he basically already knew there were going to be these long stretches where we would have little to no dialogue. And he was trusting that music could help tell the story in those moments and help the narrative unfold. And so because of that, we talked a lot in the beginning about the importance of themes and melody and how those melodies could not only develop over the course of the film and through the arc of the film, but also could carry the emotional warmth and weight that he wanted the music to carry, because the idea of kindness as a survival technique, that was very, very key to the story for him. And this familial warmth that we get from the story, both between Roz and Brightville, but also with the island itself, was something he wanted to convey in the story. So really this idea of music needing to have this vulnerability, this warmth, clear melodic statements, and then also having the ability to go from small, intimate moments to really big, huge action sequences.
So did that suggest to you from the beginning that this needed to be an orchestral score?
What really made me feel orchestral was the way to go was the hand-painted style. I think because Kris talked about early Disney animation, going back to Bambi, and also artists like Miyazaki being really huge influences for him, I think that organic feeling we got looking at the images, to me, felt like it would be great mirrored by this organic sound in the score. And then also, because there wasn't much dialogue, I knew that music was going to need to be very active in telling story. And I really feel like orchestra is still, one of the best palettes to really do that when it comes to not having something that becomes really loop based or something that becomes a bit monotonous, or it sounds like a track that we're waiting for a singer to sing on top of. Like, I think that having orchestra play in this more traditional style while modernizing it with other elements felt like a way to similarly bring that tradition of old animation to today.
Although Roz is a robot. So
Yes,
I'm wondering, did that suggest electronic music as well?
it did. So there's throughout the entire score a presence of electronics and synths, but they're composed for in a way that is trying to make them as intimately a part of the orchestra as possible. And so it's like thinking of those synths as another player that's sitting in the ensemble, and sometimes doubling orchestral parts, sometimes playing a counter melody, and then mixed in that way. Alan Meyerson, legendary score mixer, mixed this in, and he was so great at helping me with that balance of making sure that the synths always felt present but never felt like they were overtaking the orchestra. They were really balanced. And then with Roz, because her story is about being a robot that becomes more human-like as the story goes on, I also experimented with metallic sounds with this percussion ensemble, Sandbox Percussion, where I was interested in moments of Roz feeling emotion and feeling these moments of like human-like instincts. We actually have like bowed metal and different things like that to kind of give like a different sense of feeling that feels close to a synth, but it's actually an organic instrument.
That's really smart. I love that idea. So, speaking of sandbox percussion, this film takes place on an island uninhabited by people, but by obviously lots of animals. So, I'm wondering if you incorporate, because you should tell us who a sandbox percussion is, and if you use them to help set the island scene as well.
I came across their work through a friend of mine, Thomas Kotcheff, and he's worked with them before. And Sandbox Percussion is an incredible percussion ensemble out of New York. It's four guys that approach playing percussion in an unorthodox way where they treat it more like Foley, where if you go to their studio, it looks like a hardware store where there's like pipes and wood slats and like oxygen tanks and glass bottles and teacups and like all kinds of weird things. But they basically turn those into these percussion workstations, and they play it in this very collaborative way where they are very great at making it sound like there's like 7 people playing when it's only 4 of them. And so for me, I was looking for a sound that could be a modern take on a way to represent the wilderness, and not having ethnic flutes that would make me question what culture those are coming from and where are we, and is that speaking to the geography of this place. And I really love that this movie suspends our understanding of where it's taking place, and I didn't want the music to like point too much in a specific direction. And so discovering their approach to percussion felt like not only a fun way to extend the sound design world into the score, where they're playing as if there are animals skittering through the forest, or as if things are like hitting Roz's body and all of that, but it also was treated specifically in the sonic way where they're almost like ASMR on top of the orchestra, and like working with, again, Alan Meyerson to figure out how to mic them and how to mix them in a way where there's no confusion between the sound texture and timbre of their percussion with the orchestral percussion, and it's kind of its own thing, but composed in a way where they're playing together.
That's so interesting to me. Was that sort of early on in your process of trying to figure out what the sound should be?
Yeah, it's actually the first thing I did. I wrote 2 pieces of music that were not to picture at all, that were my exploration of these ideas. I wrote one piece that was an attempt to write something that felt warm and had this kind of like hopeful familial quality to it. And then I wrote another piece of music that was almost like a short action cue that was trying to capture this like feeling of like small animals skittering through the forest and all of that. And that was me doing my best sandbox percussion impression, essentially, with samples. And then Kris really loved that sound. And so then the very first cue I wrote was a pretty long sequence that would utilize that sound. And then I sent that, once Kris approved that cue, we sent it to Sandbox, and then Sandbox recorded that, a year and a half before we finished, so that I can then take those recordings and create my own sound library, because there was no library I could find that had those textures that I wanted. And so they were really integral to helping me build a toolbox to write with that then had the sound quality I was looking for.
So we've mentioned Roz, but we should probably also talk about the fact that she almost accidentally adopts an orphan gosling, which is eventually named Brightbill. And then there's a kind of funny character who we think is sort of a bad guy at first, but who sort of becomes a good guy, and that's Fink the Fox. And I'm wondering about themes. Did the key characters need their own themes? And were there other themes that perhaps didn't reflect a specific character?
Yeah, 100%. Each of those three characters had their own theme. And then there was a theme for the idea of family. And, as you know incredibly well, I think that the scores that I fell in love with and the composers I fell in love with were an integral part to the storytelling. And they were storytellers themselves, and that they were so intentional with how a theme develops, so that when we hear a theme at the most climactic moment of a movie, we feel something, and no words have to be spoken for us to feel that feeling. And I think it's largely due to not only the story unfolding, but also a composer who is being very intentional with how those themes are developing. And so my first approach is watching the whole movie and assessing moments where there should be music, and writing down whose perspective we're looking from and whose story are we kind of telling in that moment. And that kind of deduces for me who needs a theme. And so that really led to like those three characters having themes. There are a couple of other leitmotifs like Pinktail and Paddler, the beaver, has a little leitmotif, but those only appear a couple of times. But those three characters, and then this idea of family, that really came from the fact that in the most climactic emotional moments, like the migration sequence or the very end of the movie, we're not really talking about one character's perspective, and we're looking at this idea more than anything else. And so I remember pitching Kris on that very early on, that these were the themes I wanted to work on. And once we had those themes, the way I usually work is I'll find a scene that to me speaks to each of those characters, each of those ideas, and I'll write the cue for that moment. And then if we feel good about that, I kind of stress test it everywhere else, where I'll just focus on that character's arc or that idea's arc and see if this melodic theme works in each of those moments. And will it work if we have the main theme happen at the very end of the movie? Does it feel like it works there, even though it works in this earlier part? And so it kind of helps me build from the inside out.
And during this process, are you in touch with Chris Sanders a lot, sort of maybe seeking his approval or his input on some of this stuff?
Yeah, as often as possible. I mean, with this movie, even though I was on it early, we met. In the beginning, it was maybe a couple of times a month, and then after that, it was every week. And toward the end, it was a couple of times a week, and it really reminded me, as I think we've talked about, like of my childhood experience watching Steven Spielberg and John Williams work together at the piano. Because pretty early on, at first I was going into the edit, and it was me and Kris and Mary Blee, the picture editor, and Jeff. And early on, Kris and Jeff suggested that they come to my studio. And so they started coming to my place, Kris and Jeff, and often Mary. And Kris would sit right next to me at my keyboard. And because my mock-ups are as detailed as I can make them, we're able to get into the weeds on each of these pieces of music, where I can play him this theme that I was hearing, or this piece of music for a cue. And Kris is then able to say, okay, well, what's happening in this moment? Like, I feel like there's a melody here that I can't really hear. And I'll play him each of the sections. Like, here's what the violins are doing. Here's what the basses are doing. Here's what the brass is doing. And then he would say, oh, you know what? I actually really like what the brass is doing, but it feels like the strings are kind of covering that up. Can we simplify the string so that the brass can come out a little bit more? And he was so excited to dive in with me to figure out how to shape each of these pieces of music in a way that felt like they were telling the story as best as possible, and following the story as best as possible. And so it was by far one of the most collaborative experiences I've had, where he was intimately involved, but not in a controlling way, more in a we're in this together to figure it out kind of way.
Yeah, that sounds great. Is it true that you became, the reason I'm about to ask this question is because so much of The Wild Robot is about an unlikely individual who slowly becomes a parent. and the process of learning how to parent a child. And is it true that you became a parent sort of around this time or during this time, and what impact did that have on the whole process for you?
Yeah, it had a huge impact. So I just had my daughter. My wife and I just had our daughter about 6 months before I started the project, and I remember reading the book even when I was asked to join the project, and not only reading it to her. I mean, she was, again, 6 months old, so she wasn't even really aware. But for me personally, I immediately connected to this being that struggles with their own emotions and is like almost unfamiliar with their emotions, needing to discover how to express them or be in touch with them. And it's something that, music is the reason why I even am emotionally aware of myself in a lot of ways, and how I connect to my own emotions. And so having a child, I think, is like unlocked me emotionally in a very different way that I really related to with Roz. Also, watching my wife become a mother and watching her physical sacrifice, like even in pregnancy, she had a difficult pregnancy, she had a difficult birth, and the process shortly after that was challenging. So to think about these ideas of what is sacrifice as a parent, even though I was well aware of the fact that I was very early into that journey and it was only going to continue, it just was all very fresh in a way that I was buzzing with these emotional feelings as I was starting the project. And in writing even the themes, like the main theme for the movie, that was largely inspired by Kris's direction to not shy away from the complexities of being a parent. And I remember writing the main theme for the migration sequence, and initially my take on it was written from the headspace that I was in currently, which was like, there were a lot of challenges, obviously, as a parent of like a 1-year-old at the time, but I still had so much control over the situation that I was able to fool myself into feeling like I could be this perfect parent in a lot of ways. And, I'm not dealing with, like, my daughter couldn't even talk. So she couldn't even tell me if she felt a certain way or needed something different than I could give her. It felt like my wife and I were struggling or challenged, but definitely doing our best, and it felt like that was good. And I think that this movie, in terms of what Bright Bill and Roz go through, highlights the inevitability of failing as a parent, and the inevitability of, no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you literally sacrifice every part of your being, there's going to be something that happens that causes your child to need to forgive you, or to feel frustrated with you, or God forbid it, as it did for Bright Bill and Roz, like there's something that's almost irreparable that like has happened. And reflecting on that idea of like taking my daughter to college, and we're at a point where she doesn't even want to say goodbye to me, or doesn't even want to say I love you before I, maybe don't see her for a long time, is such an emotionally resonant idea that that not only helped me directly with writing the music, putting that emotion into the music, but it also is a helpful reminder at that phase for me and my wife to think about, like, just, it's okay that like we're going to try our best, and there's going to be failures along the way, and to embrace that being an imperfect human in this experience of parenthood, I think was a helpful reminder from this movie.
Yeah, it's so great. And so speaking of the migration sequence, there is a point in the movie where Roz has to say goodbye to Bright Bill, and part of that whole process is Maren Morris's song, "Kiss the Sky." So that plays kind of a crucial role around that time. And I'm wondering, tell me, if you can, what your role was in making that song work in a sort of larger dramatic context.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an incredible song. I really feel like the way that sequence plays is just a masterclass in songwriting for a movie. And Maren and the songwriters did such an incredible job making it very personal to them. And so I really give a lot of credit to Mary Blee, the picture editor, for being the brains behind the way it was put together, because basically we had a meeting one day and I asked if there's something else I could work on. And Mary was like, well, I'm cutting together this flight training sequence, and I have this song from Maren Morris that is about 3 minutes long. And this sequence I'm going to cut is like 6.5 minutes long. And I need to figure out how to make it feel like one whole idea. And she was like, I tried putting her song and then another piece of temp music, but it feels very clearly like two separate ideas. How do we make it one arc? And so I asked if Maren and the songwriters would send me the stems. And that's something that like almost never happens for composers, that a songwriter wants to share their stems with the composer. But, they were willing to give them to me. And I worked with Devon Watts, my music editor, to cut the song in a way that felt like it could match the arc of the story. And then I took that and orchestrated around it, where I not only orchestrated underneath the song itself, but then chose where the lyrics should come in and out, and like basically music edited this sequence, and then put elements of the score in there, and then created a key change and like an interstitial section and a reharmonization at the end to kind of match like this climactic moment of the whole sequence.
Always safe where you are, but safe only gets you so far. What if you look your fears right in the eye? Say you'll see them another time. What if for once you can find a piece of you that you've been hiding? You've been hiding. What if you chase your heart out to the edge? Rewrite your stars and be brave instead. What if you jump and the falling feels a little like you're flying, like you're flying?
So it was really this collaborative effort between Mary and Maren and the songwriters and myself and Devon, our music editor. And I personally, in terms of my orchestration of it and arrangement of it and embellishment around it, was just following what, again, was happening so clearly in the story, that to me, it was like when Mary showed me that 6.5 minute sequence, I was like, yes, this is one idea. I get it. And so all of those ideas of adding other sections and doing a key change and reharmonization was all from this place of clarity, emotional clarity for what was being cut together in the edit.
Well, it's masterful. It works so well in the picture. And the song, which, by the way, is my favorite song of any movie this year,
Wow.
I just think is a really special moment in a special film. But let me ask you, from a different point of view, What sequence or sequences pose the biggest challenge to you?
The cue called I Could Use a Boost, which is the migration cue right after that flight sequence, which I've talked about why it was a challenge for me in terms of like even the emotional part of it. After that, I'd say the whole last like act of the movie was a huge challenge, because like most animated movies, this is kind of wall to wall music, but that's like almost 30 minutes, I think, of straight action essentially, and also action that's continuing to escalate, where you have these, the threat of these robots, and then all of a sudden the threat of Roz being taken, and then also the threat of like her maybe not being there, and then the threat of a fire. It's like the stakes are continually being raised, and you have to feel like the journey is like one fluid idea, even though it's like all these different levels up. For me, my process was studying, the great at doing that, which is John Williams in my mind, and how there's so many of those action sequences. I literally went back to the Star Wars Episode 4, and like how the last 30 minutes of that movie,
which is all action,
exactly, and I think I have to go back and see my notes, but I'm pretty sure I counted like over 50 times that themes are quoted, and it's so like very, very intentional with like when those themes are reprised, and like sometimes where they're varied in a way where you can't even really tell it's the theme, but it actually is, and moments where we're questioning what's going to happen and the theme happens in a different way because that's what the feeling is. And the other thing I noticed is like he's so great at setting a tempo and like a motor, and then knowing when to change keys. Because I think watching it, I was like, well, how am I going to approach this? Like, it feels like every 10 seconds there's something new happening that I need to adjust to. And listening to his music, I was like, oh, I can set up this motor, and if I change the orchestration after 10 seconds, even if I stay in the same key or keep the same motor, it's going to mark that shift. Or if I, change key at this moment, it's going to create this feeling. If I change the key going up or down, that's going to create this feeling. Or if I quote this theme at this moment. So really it was trying to approach each section in a very specific way, and then always taking a step back to look at how does this whole thing work. And I would work on the first, minute and a half and get it to a point where I had an idea of where it was going to start and finish. But before doing too much, I would jump to the next section to see how that would like kind of tie into it. Then sometimes I jump to the end to see how I was going to end, so I can make sure that I don't get too big before the ending. So it felt very similar to like painting a mural, where like sometimes you're focusing on this one little section, but you always have to keep going back to realize like how are all these colors playing together and these dimensions and proportions playing together. And that was a big challenge, but a lot of fun.
Oh, that's great. It's great to hear. It sounds so complicated to me as a civilian listening to this. I have to ask you, how long did you have to work all of this out? I mean, was it a matter of months or even longer?
Longer. So for the whole movie, it was about a year and a half, almost 2 years. And for the last sequence, I've probably spent the last 2 months or so just on that last sequence. And so we had a lot of time, which I think allowed not only for that intricacy, but also for me to write things that were very specific to picture. I remember talking to my friend Daniel Pemberton, who's incredible composer, and especially for animated films. And he watched the movie and he was like, "Oh God!" He's like, "How?" Like he's like, "I could tell that music was written to picture. How did you guys get to do that? Because so many times as composers, we write music that's just music edited and chopped and like not at all how we intended, or we have to write music that can be easily edited so that we don't have to worry about writing a picture." And I really had this beautiful time on this project where the way that Chris Sanders led this project had so much clarity that I was writing to picture, even when it was those animatic black and white pencil sketches, so that the cues that I wrote with a lot of detail and orchestration and gestures for certain cuts and things like that, I only had to massage them to the picture once I saw the final animation, but it wasn't a lot of adjustment, so I could really focus on details in a way over the course of that time.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Where did you record, and how big was your orchestra?
We recorded in London. We did most of it at Air Studios, and then we did a pickup session at Abbey Road. Sandbox was actually recorded in New York at Power Station, and it ended up being a little over 100 pieces. It was, strings, woodwinds, brass, a large percussion ensemble, choir, some synths. So it ended up being a pretty large group.
Was that the largest that you ever written for?
I think so, actually. I never actually looked at it, but I'm pretty sure it felt like it, so I'm pretty sure.
And how big was your choir?
About 40 singers.
Wow, that is a lot. Are they singing anything at any point, or is it just oohs and ahs?
It's oohs and ahs primarily because going back to that idea of suspending the question of where we are, we didn't want to choose a language to do that. And for the most part, they're treated pretty texturally. There's one fun Easter egg, actually, where toward the end of the movie, when Roz is leaving the island, there's a melody that the choir sings with the strings that is actually quoting the melody from the song from the end credits. Nobody has pointed it out really, but it's just this moment where we wanted to see this idea emotionally that is delivered in the lyrics of the end credits. That's like the closest we got to even trying to put lyrics in there. We didn't put the lyrics in, but we had that idea.
Are you playing anything on this? Are we listening to any Kris Bowers piano?
Yes. Yeah. A lot of it. I think for me, when I was studying piano, I used to love the fact that I could tell the difference between Keith Jarrett or Herbie Hancock or Oscar Peterson or Brad Mehldau, like just within a few seconds of how they touch the piano. And I realized with writing film music how much of the way I approach my touch on the piano is largely informed by how I feel when I'm playing it. And so everything down to like the way that I might roll a chord or the way I might lay behind the beat or any of that kind of stuff, or the velocity which I'm playing a key. Anytime I've had another piano player play it, I always feel like a little frustrated by it essentially. And so I've always chosen to have another piano player play the orchestral parts so that I can be in the room with the director and be listening to the score from that point. And also, so we can still record piano with the orchestra in that kind of old school way. But all of the solo piano moments where piano's playing a melody and really coming out, that's me playing.
I think it's nice that it's personalized in that sense.
Yeah, I think so too. It also is like, it kind of is a nod to Thomas, my love for Thomas Newman in a way too. I feel like
whose work you can always tell it's specifically him on piano.
Exactly. I think I've always loved that about his music.
Can you talk a little bit about Dolby Atmos, how that helps in the presentation of music in the theater, and if you have to do a remix, if the soundtrack album will be in Dolby Atmos?
Yes. So Alan Meyerson was so crucial with that. I mean, he not only did another mix for us for the soundtrack that is in Dolby Atmos, but he is working with me to decide how we spread the score through the Atmos array. And especially with things like the sandbox percussion that I wanted to have this ASMR effect. He's deciding like when do we place that above us, to the side of us, behind us. And then we are being really intentional with that and then sending it to the dub stage at Skywalker. And I was really fortunate to be a big part of the mix with this and going to the dub for the final mix and collaborating with Chris Sanders and Gary Rizzo, the supervising mixer, to continue to decide how we place everything. And so there are so many moments where we want the score to feel like it's this fully immersive thing. And so it has to go like all around us in a way that you can only do with Atmos. There's also moments like there's a storm sequence where she goes to try to put up her transmitter signal. And there's all these like tinkling kind of metallic light sounding pitter patter percussion things that are all kind of in the ceiling arrays and like kind of give this different feeling to them. So I always feel like I think there's something prehistoric with how we relate to sound in terms of frequency range. And I also feel like there's something prehistoric to how we relate to where that is around us. And so it's a lot of fun to play with like, where do certain frequencies come? Do they come from above us, behind us, the side of us, in front of us? And a score like this with so many different textures and not much dialogue where we're able to really play with those textures intentionally and not have it be covered up by something allowed me and Alan and then Gary to get in there and play with the Atmos mix in a really fun way on this score.
I always have to explain to people that you have an Academy Award, but not for music, rather for the documentary short subject that you produced last year, The Last Repair Shop. Yeah. But now you actually do have a nomination for writing an original score. How does that feel? Oh man, it feels very surreal and emotional. Like I was texting with Ben Proudfoot, my co-director on The Last Repair Shop, and on Concertos of Conversation, and telling him how this felt different because this is the category I paid attention to when I was a kid, and also the category that how I discovered most of the film composers I know outside of watching movies. I would go look at who won the Oscar and I'd go buy that score and study it. And to be on this list, I think means so much because of that historic kind of landmark. And I also think that it means so much because to be nominated, you are voted on by the branch, by the music branch, and by these composers who I've respected and admired for such a long time. And for that body of people to feel like the work that I did was deserving of that nomination, I think means so much. Well, I can't think of a more perfect score for a movie I've heard this year than yours for The Wild Robot. And so I can only thank you for being with us today, Kris, and wish you the best of luck as award season rolls on.
Thank you so much, John. It's always a pleasure. I really appreciate that.
Many thanks to Kris for joining us on the podcast today. We wish you the best on Oscar Sunday, March 2nd at the Dolby Theater here in Hollywood. And of course, thanks to Jon Burlingame for conducting yet another excellent interview. And an extra special thanks to our friends at DreamWorks Animation for helping us put this conversation together. Be sure to check out The Wild Robot ahead of the Oscars broadcast. It's available to stream in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos, and we will have links, as always, in our show notes. And speaking of awards, if you'd like even more conversations with fellow Academy Award nominees in this category and others, be sure you are subscribed to Dolby Creator Talks. Many of these awards are tough to pick and predict, and we will continue to offer in-depth interviews filled with unique insights into the work of these nominated artists, which might make it a little bit easier for you to fill out your Oscar ballot, whether you are an Academy voter or simply want to do better in your annual Oscar office pool. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube, in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. If you're curious to know more about what we do at Dolby Creator Lab, head on over to dolbycreatorlab.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of the show, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. and our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining us.